Imagine standing in front of thousands trained to never move, no matter what. But what if breaking that rule meant saving a life? This royal guard had been taught one thing above all else: never break formation, never react, never move. But when an elderly war hero collapses before him, gasping for breath, he's faced with an impossible choice: follow the rules or follow his heart. What happens next shocks the entire kingdom, stuns the royal family, and makes history. Was he a disgrace to his duty or a true hero? Watch until the end to find out. Before we start, comment below where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. And don't forget, if this story keeps you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful tales. Now, let's dive into this incredible moment of courage, honor, and defiance. The sun blazed high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the grand palace courtyard, where the kingdom's most prestigious event was about to unfold. The royal banners fluttered in the warm breeze, their rich crimson and gold embroidery shimmering like fire. The stone-paved square, lined with towering white columns, stretched before the royal palace, where the king and his advisors sat upon an elevated dais, surveying the scene with regal composure. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Nobles in flowing silks, foreign dignitaries in elaborate robes, and common folk lucky enough to witness the event stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed ahead. Some whispered in hushed tones about the significance of the day, a commemoration of the kingdom's greatest victories, a tribute to those who had defended its honor. At the heart of the spectacle stood the royal guard. A force unlike any other, they were the very symbol of duty and discipline. Clad in impeccable uniforms of deep navy and gleaming silver breastplates, they stood in perfect unison, silent, motionless, unshaken. Their ceremonial swords, polished to a mirror finish, gleamed under the sunlight, reflecting the awe of the gathered crowd. For centuries, the royal guard had upheld a reputation of unyielding devotion. They did not flinch, did not react, no matter what happened around them. They were more than men. They were living statues, a testament to the kingdom's strength. Among the spectators stood Colonel Edward Grant. His presence alone commanded respect. An elderly war veteran, his hair silvered by time, his posture still dignified despite the weight of age. His chest bore an array of medals, each representing battles fought and victories earned in the service of his kingdom. He was a soldier through and through, a man who had once led warriors into battle, a name that had been spoken with reverence in military circles. And yet, despite his accolades, he stood humbly among the people, not as a man seeking glory, but as one honored simply to be there. As the ceremony unfolded, the royal fanfare blared, trumpets echoing across the courtyard. The guards began their precision drill, marching in absolute synchronization, their boots striking the ground in rhythmic thunder. Then, something unexpected happened. Colonel Grant staggered. A sharp pain shot through his chest, his vision blurred, his breathing quickened. He tried to steady himself, but his legs buckled beneath him. And before anyone could react, he collapsed. The air, once thick with ceremony and grandeur, turned still in an instant. Colonel Edward Grant, the honored war hero, had faltered. His legs, once sturdy as the steel of the kingdom's finest blades, gave way beneath him. His breath hitched, and for a moment the world around him blurred, the banners, the palace, the sea of onlookers, all faded into a haze. Then he fell. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd like a wave crashing upon the shore. A noblewoman clasped a hand over her mouth. A young squire, standing on the edges of the square, flinched as if he had just witnessed something forbidden. Even the foreign emissaries, usually composed and unshaken, exchanged uncertain glances. For a man of such stature, such history, to collapse in the heart of the kingdom's most sacred ceremony, it was unthinkable. Yet, despite the distress in the crowd, the royal guards remained frozen in place. Not a single head turned. Not a single hand wavered. Even as Colonel Grant lay sprawled upon the cold stone pavement, his chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven breaths, the guards did not move. Their eyes were fixed forward, their bodies locked in perfect stillness, just as they had been trained. To the outside world, it seemed almost inhuman, to ignore a fallen man, to stand idle in the face of crisis. But such was the code of the royal guard. No distraction, no deviation, no reaction. Not even for a dying hero. The silence was deafening. The weight of it pressed upon the ceremony, turning what had once been a day of pride into something tense, uncertain, cold. Would no one move? Would protocol truly outweigh humanity? A battle of duty and conscience. Among the statuesque soldiers, one man struggled against his instincts. Lieutenant James Alden stood in formation, his hand tightening around the hilt of his ceremonial sword. He had trained for this moment for years. To be unshakable. To be immovable. He knew the rules better than anyone. No guard had ever broken rank. No matter the storm, the pain, or the chaos, the royal guard stood firm. And yet, his heart pounded against his ribs like a war drum. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, suffocating. The man on the ground wasn't just anyone. He was Colonel Edward Grant. A legend. A warrior. A man who had bled for this kingdom before James had even earned his place in the guard. James had grown up hearing stories of the colonel's bravery. He had once dreamed of becoming a soldier just like him. And now that same man was dying at his feet. His fingers twitched. His pulse raced. No one moved. No one even dared to breathe. James' jaw clenched. And then, against all expectation, he stepped forward. The sound of James Alden's boot striking the stone pavement was like thunder in the silence. The instant he broke formation, the crowd erupted, gasps, whispers, frantic exchanges of disbelief. A royal guard had moved. It was unthinkable. Unprecedented. James ignored it all. With quick, measured steps, he reached Colonel Grant and dropped to one knee, his rigid ceremonial armor groaning as it bent for the first time in his career. His hands, trained for war, worked swiftly. He pressed 2 fingers to the veteran's neck, a pulse but weak. His breathing was ragged, unsteady. James cursed under his breath. There was no time. He acted on instinct. Carefully, he adjusted the colonel's posture, tilting his head slightly to open his airway, easing his shoulders to relieve pressure on his lungs. A soldier's training extended beyond the battlefield. Every royal guard underwent extensive first aid instruction, but never had James imagined he would need it here. The crowd murmured, some in admiration, others in outrage. Among the noble class, a viscount scoffed and shook his head. "This is disgraceful," he whispered to another. "A guard abandoning his post for a single man?" Another official, a high-ranking general, clenched his fists but said nothing, his expression unreadable. Meanwhile, a young woman in the crowd, her eyes wide with shock, spoke in a hushed, almost reverent tone. He moved, for him? James blocked it all out. He had one priority. Save the colonel. Eyes of the king. But above him, from the royal balcony, the weight of power bore down. The king himself sat in his high-backed throne, his face unreadable, his golden crown glinting in the sunlight. Seated beside him, his advisors leaned in, whispering among themselves, their expressions tense. A royal guard breaking protocol in front of thousands. What would this mean? The king's gaze was fixed on James. Not a word left his lips. Was he angry? Impressed? Would James be disgraced or honored? James didn't care. He knew what he had just done. And he knew the price he was about to pay. He had just thrown his career away. The harsh murmurs of the crowd faded into a dull hum as James Alden focused on the man before him. Colonel Edward Grant, the war hero, the legend, his savior. A faint, rasping whisper broke the silence between them. You've grown into a fine soldier? James froze. His breath caught in his throat. The firm grip he had on the colonel's arm wavered for just a moment. That voice. It was weaker, thinner than before, but he knew it. His pulse pounded in his ears, and suddenly the courtyard, the ceremony, the tension in the air, it all vanished. And in its place came a memory. Years ago, a battlefield of fire and blood. James had once been young, reckless, and naive. A fresh recruit, barely 20, full of pride and ambition. That was before the ambush. It had been a mission gone horribly wrong. The night was thick with smoke, the air poisoned by the metallic scent of blood. Arrows rained down, swords clashed, and the screams of fallen comrades echoed through the battlefield. James had been there, wounded, bleeding, his vision swimming. He had thought in that moment that his story was over, that he was just another nameless soldier about to be swallowed by war. But then he felt strong arms lifting him. He had barely been conscious, his body limp as the weight of exhaustion threatened to pull him under, but he had seen him. Colonel Edward Grant. Through fire and steel, the colonel dragged him to safety, shielding him from enemy arrows, barking orders to his men. James had survived because of him. Because of his courage. Because of his sacrifice. Back to the present. The memory flashed and vanished as James snapped back to reality, his hands pressing against the colonel's chest, feeling the faint rise and fall of his breath. This wasn't just any veteran. This was his savior. And now fate had reversed their roles. The hero of the past was in danger, and the soldier he once protected was his only hope. James' jaw tightened. He knew what was at stake. His career. His reputation. his future. None of it mattered. There was no choice. He would not let him die. The murmurs of the crowd grew uneasy, whispers snaking through the courtyard like a gathering storm. Would the guard be punished? The royal guard had never broken formation before, not for a fallen noble, not for a wailing child, not even for fire or war. Yet here was Lieutenant James Alden on his knees, tending to Colonel Edward Grant, defying centuries of unyielding tradition. The tension was palpable. The other guards remained motionless, their faces impassive, but their minds raced. Some of them had trained with James, knew his discipline, his unwavering commitment. If even he had broken protocol, what did that mean? And then, a sound rippled through the air. The king had risen from his seat. Gasps spread like wildfire. The king never left his throne during formal ceremonies. His movements were calculated, deliberate, a reflection of power itself. Yet now the king's hands pressed against the gilded arms of his throne, and slowly, he stood. A king's judgment. The air grew still. Every eye turned toward the royal balcony, where King Aldrich III stood tall and unmoving, his deep crimson robes billowing slightly in the afternoon breeze. His crown, adorned with precious gems, glinted under the sunlight, but his face remained unreadable. For a long moment he simply watched. His gaze swept over James Alden, the young guard who had thrown away his career for an act of humanity. He looked at Colonel Edward Grant, a man who had once been a warrior but now lay frail on the ground, his body betraying the strength of his past. Then, in a move just as unprecedented as James' defiance, the king descended the royal steps. A silence like no other. The murmuring ceased. Even the advisors, who had been whispering anxiously among themselves, fell into stunned silence. With slow, measured steps, the king walked down from his elevated dais, across the polished marble, and toward the fallen veteran and the kneeling guard. His royal cloak dragged behind him, its embroidered edges sweeping across the courtyard stones. Every movement was deliberate, every step echoed with meaning. As he reached them, James bowed his head, bracing for what he knew was coming. Punishment. A demotion. Disgrace. But then, the king knelt. The words that changed everything. The world seemed to stop. For the first time in decades, the king, ruler of the realm, bent his knee before a common soldier and a veteran of war. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even the royal guards, trained to remain unaffected, stiffened in shock. And then the king spoke. His voice, deep and resolute, carried across the square. There is no greater duty than to honor those who have served. The words shattered the tension like a hammer striking glass. A hush fell over the crowd. The accusing whispers turned to quiet awe. Instead of punishment, there was recognition. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then, a sound shattered the silence. A single clap. Then another. Then another. And suddenly, a roar of applause erupted. The courtyard, which had been frozen in tension only moments before, erupted with cheers. The same nobles who had whispered in disapproval now rose to their feet, their admiration overpowering their adherence to tradition. The common folk, once afraid to even speak, cheered the loudest of all. In the midst of it all, James Alden knelt frozen, his breath shallow, his heart racing. Had this really happened? Had the king himself, knelt beside him and validated his defiance? His career, once hanging by a thread, was no longer a matter of shame or disgrace. He had not been cast out. He had been hailed as a hero. A salute of the ages. A weak movement from below caught James' attention. Colonel Edward Grant, his breath still unsteady, lifted a trembling hand. Slowly, deliberately, he raised it to his brow. A salute. James' chest tightened. The moment was surreal. A man who had once been his savior, now acknowledging him not just as a soldier, but as his equal. And as if guided by instinct, James lifted his own hand in response, returning the gesture. The past and present had collided. Two soldiers, one from a bygone era, one from the new generation, connected by duty, sacrifice, and honor. The image of the moment burned itself into history. The moment that spread across the world. The royal photographers who had been documenting the ceremony snapped their shots. Within hours, the image swept across the world. News channels, newspapers, and social media platforms exploded. The headlines came in a wave. Royal Guard defies protocol to save a war hero, a new era of honor? The soldier who moved, a guard's humanity wins the king's favor. Tradition versus duty, a royal moment that will be remembered forever. Debates erupted. Some argued that rules existed for a reason. Others insisted that true honor was knowing when to break them. But regardless of opinion, one thing was certain. The world had changed that day. The meaning of duty, of honor, of service, it had been redefined. And in history's pages, a lesson had been etched for generations to come. Honor is not just about standing still. It's about knowing when to move. What do you think? Was Lieutenant James Alden right to break protocol? Or should tradition and discipline always come first? Would you have done the same in his position? Is true honor found in unwavering duty, or in the courage to stand up when it matters most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about honor and duty, hit that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story like this. We bring you tales of courage, history, and humanity, stories that stay with you long after the screen fades to black. And remember, sometimes the greatest show of strength isn't in standing still, but in knowing when to move.